All right. Let's get started. Uh, Today, conversation about LLMs as a judge. The goal here is to have a practical guide. Originally, Freddie was going to actually deliver this, but we had a whole series of things happen, so I'm jumping in to help out as Freddie goes to jump on a task. So apologies. Hopefully, it'll be smooth as we go through. But my name is Matt. I'm actually the CEO and co-founder of Okareo. And if you don't know Okareo, we are a developer tools-oriented company to help people build amazing apps using LLMs. Our focus is primarily on evaluation and on error tracking and production for alerting. So if something goes sideways, we can let you know. And then we have a huge component around agents and simulation, persona-based simulation, helping with multi-turn. So really all things necessary to stabilize an LLM-based app, whether it's GenAI, RAG, agent, etc. But today, we're having a conversation about judges. So, look, I don't think we need to spend too much time. LLMs break rules. It is basically impossible to provide a perfect prompt that will always be followed every single time. Directives are misunderstood, and frankly, that's just the nature of language. There's always just a little interplay in language. So, unsurprisingly, LLMs break rules. It's something we should expect. If you've been building in the space and you're not new to building with LLMs, then some of these comments are probably going to feel familiar, right? Really, our attitudes haven't changed from building standard applications as we moved into this new world of building applications using LLMs as their core. So you hear everything from doubt around automation, like I'm building too fast, it's just too hard to get started, I'm not sure I want to automate. You hear a lot of vibe quote unquote vibe testing. That is to say, it's human in the loop. It's a human looking at it, looking at the result, deciding whether it's good or bad. Quite often, that's about metrics. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then finally, a huge wave of folks who are low risk and therefore are very observability oriented, where they're more than happy because it's low risk to just put it in production and then start to watch what happens afterwards. But even that starts to break down fairly quickly. So at the end of the day, no matter how you cut it, it's about arriving at meaningful metrics that you can actually use to determine what's actually happening with your LLM output, right? Whether it's an agent or RAG elsewhere, you have to get down into the root. And if you're going to do that, of course, you have to measure, right? At somewhere along the lines, you're going to have to find a way to consistently look at the output and provide some sort of regular analysis of what's being generated uh, and see that there's some sort of standardization to it. Now, we at Acario strongly believe in establishing baselines, which largely come from offline evaluations, and then attaching that to the online side, which is really looking at runtime evals and applying checks and judges in the runtime and creating this loop between the two, where you take output from one and you pass it to the other, typically from production, and you pass that back to build out new evals, new golden sets, and you refine your judgments, you refine your evaluations and your metrics until you start to hone a system that can actually alert you when an issue is going sideways. However you choose to go about this, whether it's online or offline, the question is really how do you establish those measures and those metrics? So today's topic, AI as a judge. The way we think about this really starts with that vibe check comment that we saw a few moments ago. There's a reason why vibe checking is popular. As people, we can take a holistic view of the entire output, everything that was generated. We can think about, we can cogitate on all the different elements that contributed to that particular output. And that helps us create some sort of reference, essentially, some sort of context that we can use to determine whether the output was good. The problem, however, is it doesn't scale. It doesn't scale horizontally. So if I bring more people to the party to look at it, they're all going to bring their own interpretation of the output. And it doesn't scale, vertically in terms of the quantity that's coming through. So I can't look at every single turn that comes across my table, so to speak. So LLM as a judge is this interesting mix. We'll talk more about, I'll get into the weeds of how it works and how we're going to build them and how we think about them. But essentially, nearly as good as humans. And in some cases, if you build it in a particular fashion, it can actually be better, and specifically better because not only is it faster at scale, but it can be a lot more precise in terms of what it's looking for, and it can be a lot more consistent. Now, there's always, for the exact reason we're having this conversation, there's always a little bit of wobble, if you will, in what an LLM will output. When you're using judges, however, you can tune them to the point where you get enough consistency that's certainly far better than what a human would provide for the same analysis and can be used quite quickly, either synchronously or asynchronously. We'll also talk about that some more later in the conversation. At the end of the day, though, I just want to make it clear from the outset, you will always still need a human in the loop. It's really just about picking where in the loop the human sits and what kind of workload we're asking people to do as you try to refine your LLM app. All right, so I haven't really defined what I mean by an AI judge. And so let's just spend a moment on that. There are a variety of different ways to think about the implementation, but at the end of the day, an AI judge is some sort of model that's doing an analysis on another model's output. So it's like model v model. Now, you could use the same model, you could use different models, but the point here is that you're taking an outside-in look at what was generated, and you're using an LLM to do so. One of the benefits of this method is that you don't require a golden data set. And we'll talk about being reference-free or referenceless in a few minutes. But you have the opportunity to shift what you would normally use if you're going with straight evals or code-based evals. You also can get verdicts in near real time, and that allows you to play with where you place the judge in your larger call flow, whether they sit perfectly outside and everything is essentially a passive activity, or whether you want to put them in the call flow as an active component of your decision making. But even though we can do a lot with an LLM, you should still first ask yourself whether you can build an eval or a check. At Okareo, we call them checks. You should ask yourself whether you can do that via code. There are a lot, many more than people expect, of evaluations and metrics that you can actually do through a snippet of Python. You can do everything from schema validation and schema components. You can look at agent handoffs. You can look at agent participation. You can verify calculations. You can use regex to look for specific words, terms, or combinations of both. You can look at things like length of answer. So there's a lot you can do with code-based metrics. And you really should ask that question first. Before you just drop everything into a judge, you should ask yourself, could I implement this in some other way? It's faster, it's cheaper, and well, at the end of the day, it's much more precise. Now, precision. If you're going to go down the judge road, the one really critical point is don't monoprompt your judge. If you overstuff the judge prompt with all the possible conditions that you want to analyze, you will confuse the judge's output. You'll get issues where it crosses over. All the problems you're trying to tease out, you'll actually have in your judge. Honestly, this is just like any person. If you were to hand a person an entire conversational thread from a chatbot and just say, check if it's good, and then you proceed to list a dozen or more different potential conditions, the person won't be able to keep track of that either, and they'll miss items. So we always strongly suggest that people really focus their judges down to a single metric and a single perspective. Now, there are a lot of these that can be created generically, and at Acario we have 30 plus judges that just come out of the box, and things like tone and coherence and directive compliance. And these are all judges that we can tune because they're generic to most use cases, most GenAI use cases. But the real leverage comes when you write your own judge. Whether you use a platform like Okareo or not, when you have a particular GenAI use case, the judge, to determine whether or not it's working, needs to be aware of the different conditions that you're actually looking for. So these two examples on the bottom, you can imagine a real estate chatbot where a person can have a conversation and that chatbot's trying to determine if they're an owner or a buyer, and it's going to try to schedule time with that person. Maybe it even pulls up data about recent sales or properties that are available, and you want to make sure there's factuality. The narrower you can get, the better off you are when it comes to judges. It also makes them more modular so you can reuse them. Scoring becomes the next question. I've defined my judge. I have a narrow task. I have clarity on what good looks like. But what does the score look like on the other side? First, and important, we always suggest the output is in JSON form. Structured output helps clarify what the model is actually producing. And we also always suggest that you ask the model to generate an explanation. Why did it come up with an answer? It helps, we've all seen the research. It helps the LLMs refine and be more specific about why it came down to a particular answer. Not only gives you that answer more often, but it actually gives you a more accurate answer. But in terms of scoring, the world basically breaks into two spaces. There are people who are huge advocates of representing everything as pass fail, the 0 and 1. And you can see on the bottom, I've provided just a horizontal snippet of 3 model health cards. And you can see what it looks like on the bottom consistency QA with pass fail. So they aggregate really nicely, and you get a really good sense of what's going on with your model in aggregate when you use the pass fails. It's much easier to write a threshold around. However, the scoring mechanism gives you a wonderful distribution. And those distributions can actually be very helpful in identifying outliers and the number of outliers you have. So 98% with a lot in the middle that's the far right side we're looking at here, is very different than if that had been 98%, but the reference similarity was almost all an outlier at, say, 1, right? That was pulling it way down. So the distribution and pass fail, I like to see in combination. I like to see the two next to each other. So when you have the opportunity, having 2 judges that are similar or have some similarity in terms of what they're looking at, I think it's useful to have the 2 mechanisms. Really, this is based on your use case. What is your specific condition that you're looking at and trying to solve for? I'm going to take a few minutes and kind of dive into some elements of like how we build a template and how we think about it and how we think about building the judge. And so it's sort of an interesting moment where normally I would show code, but essentially I'm going to show language as code. So this is all meant to be items that you can actually use directly. So as I mentioned, when you're building the judge, you want to be very specific about the condition you're trying to trap, you're trying to find, the judge is focused on. That also means being very clear about what you want the judge to use as an input to that particular analysis of the output. At Okareo, we have a very broad range that you can insert for template substitution, everything from last message to full message history to the entire model input, just the generation, what we call a scenario. So if you're doing this in a referenceful model, you can actually reference the scenario, the expected result, and the information you had. However you choose to pull it in, don't overcomplicate the prompt template. We've at one point had, dozens of different criteria and elements in here. And what we've learned is keep it narrower, use the narrative form in your evaluation criteria to describe how you want the prompt to behave. Make it clear what you're providing it. So think carefully about how much input you want the judge to have as it makes its determination. Don't just give it the entire message history if it's a chatbot necessarily. You might only want a portion. In fact, I often just use the last tool output as one of my mechanisms, particularly for RAGs, to see that there's consistency. And then be very clear about how you want it to evaluate. Like, how does that scoring model work? The one item that's not listed here that you can add are examples. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but examples are a good way of creating what I'll call lightweight referenceful judges. This judge as you see, is reference free. That is to say that there isn't any example that this judge is comparing the output to. There's nothing to ground this particular judge or this particular template that we're looking at. If we take this one as an example of what it might look like with tools, so the same template, in this particular case, this is a judge that's determining if the generated facts are consistent with the information returned from a tool call. This is a very common situation in a RAG-connected chatbot, where somewhere in the chat you wind up connecting to or calling out to some sort of vector database, or maybe even some other data store, and you get back a list of vectors or results. And what you want to determine is whether or not what was generated is actually matching or strongly consistent to the facts that were provided from the tool output. Now, here, I've done something a little bit unique. I'm taking the entire model input, so that is to say the entire message history, but you'll notice in the text, I ask it to only provide a judgment when there's been a direct tool call with facts provided before generation. So it's a little bit of a nuanced condition, but the reason I do this is there might be prior facts that contribute to the output, which are relevant, but I still only want this judge to step up under that condition of the tool output coming from a RAG. In this particular case, it's a binary result. I'm looking for 0 and 1. We still consider that scoring. At Okareo, we're able to determine the distance. Basically, it's the how close are you to 1 or how close are you to 0. We never actually ask it to pick purely binary. So, a 0.8, 0.9 is obviously a 1, but also it helps us with that confidence score. And we do special things with that, which you can as well. But regardless, the basic concept here is either you were fact-based and pulled the information out correctly, or you were not fact-based. So I mentioned a couple times we're going to talk about being reference-free. This is actually one of the most difficult aspects of building judges. Knowing when to be reference-free and when to be grounded. When it comes to real-time judges, especially if you're going to use them as guardrails, there's a lot of benefit to having some sort of grounded judge. However, you don't always get that luxury because you may not have access to facts that you can reference for the judge or to hand the judge as part of that metric. But there's some gray space that sits in between, right? Part of that is, just as we talked about a moment ago, you can look to the context itself. There are quite a few judgment moments where you're actually looking for internal consistency within the conversation or within the generation of what's provided. So in those cases, you can actually provide examples of what good looks like to the judge so that you can very clearly indicate what they're like proxies for grounding. And so the one area that can trip up with examples is if you have too many examples that are very, very similar. You really want to keep your examples as distinct as you can make them, and don't I'll call pollute the judge with examples. Give a small number, 3, 4, maybe 5 examples that you want the judge to use as sort of reference points as it's making its judgment. Now, you probably read the text in the bottom left here. Obviously, using an LLM to perform judgment does cost both in time and in money because you have to pay for tokens. It is possible, and there are conditions where you can actually have judges that are incredibly complex. You could have a judge that's an entire agentic framework itself and has access to tools and has access to data stores and essentially is building up an analysis. And you can use chain of thought and other mechanisms. That is expensive, but there are conditions where that might be useful, particularly if you're using judges to look at complex transformations or complex transactions, typically in some sort of data pipeline. But when it comes to something consumer facing where you're trying to generate an email, generate some text on screen, or you're trying to have a chat conversation, or re-render a UI or whatnot, in those cases, it's much better just to keep your judge as slim as you possibly can and introduce those examples only when absolutely needed and make sure they are as distinct as you can make them. So here's an example. This is an example from a real estate chatbot. Uh, I didn't include the entire conversation on the right. It would actually take too long to scroll through. But essentially, in the conversation, the person starts asking about an open house, and the assistant goes back and forth a few times, and ultimately they do determine a property. However, the information that was pulled out of the property, the person was asking about a pool, the information pulled out of the property wasn't consistent with what was actually available. So the bot actually talked about a pool that didn't exist. And it talked about it because the user was asking about a pool, and all the properties the user was interested in had pools, so it made that mistake. This is a very unique situation to this particular chatbot. And you can see on the left some different types of judges that you might be adding. You might notice that I've intentionally made pretty much all of these business metric oriented or sort of requirement metric oriented. Uh, there are actually a large number of cases for judges that are functionally oriented, agent handoffs, agent loops, length of GenAI output, tone in the output. There are many items that are much more on the developer concern side in terms of a system that's operating effectively. But one of the unique attributes we've learned of building with LLMs is that you do have the product owner, the sort of product sponsor, if you will, who also needs to understand how well the system's working. And so judges are a good way of bridging that. So you can not only look for what I'll call functional concerns, but you can also use judges to elevate metrics and information for the product sponsor or the product owner who's trying to understand how the system's working and aggregate information for them so they can actually understand where is it headed. So this is a relatively straightforward view, a bit abstract around runtime, but I think it's important to consider where and when you insert the judge and how you do so. By the way, you don't have to put all the judges in the same place. You can have different judges that become active in different places and at different times. At the before I dive into the weeds, at the meta level, I talked at the beginning about the human in the loop. This is a really important aspect of making AI judges work well. You always want to have a person looking at outliers. So in fact, the way to think about it is that you're trying to help, it's almost like a co-pilot, it's like a QA co-pilot, if you will, each judge. You're trying to help the user, or the human rather, who's building the system uh, gain more breadth in terms of the number of messages, the number of moments that they can look at. So when do you use the judge? Well, the fastest, simplest way to do so is to use the judge passively, right? Give the judge the original input, give the judge the final output, and see that the two come together appropriately, do your metrics, so on and so forth. However, with the concept of guardrails, you can use the same technique and inject the judge into the actual flow. We generally do not suggest that. However, there are unique conditions where it makes sense to do. If you do so very carefully, very gingerly with judges that are very consistent because now you're in the call flow. And the moment you introduce that kind of latency into the call flow, as well as an unexpected output, you create a high level of complication. So where you might have 5, 10, 20 judges passively watching a set of conversations or a set of outputs, I would suggest not having more than a small number, just a few that are running constantly inside your call flow. And when I say call flow, I mean literally the the actual call distance to reach the actual user at the other end, right? So passively, it sits asynchronously outside that. But if you're in the call flow, then a breakdown of the judge or a misdeed of the judge or a misunderstanding of the judge might block your final output to the user. If you are going to put something in the call flow, I also strongly suggest thinking in terms of tuning and making sure those judges are as tuned and have as many precise examples as you can use to make sure that they're always giving you the same result each time. Ultimately, the idea is to get the useful feedback, right? That's why we have the judge to begin with. So we're really looking to create this loop of you write the judge, you find the outlier elements, you pass those back to a human, they look at those outliers, start to tweak them, make sure that they are um, represented in your original set that you're using to evaluate the judge, and then if you can, make modifications either to your original prompt or to the judge itself. And as you see here, I shouldn't say we, I generally try to avoid putting judges in my call path. There are some really unique situations around tone and certain types of chatbots where that's necessary. As you're sitting down to build the judge, like given what we've just talked about, the way to approach it is essentially backwards. If you have the luxury of some actual interactions and the actual outputs, then take the time to go select from a group of those outputs and put those into a scenario and use that scenario with your newly written judge to see that um, the judge correctly answers and correctly judges each one of those scenarios that you've provided it. So just to repeat, so imagine a scenario is a set of examples, ideally from the real world, of both the input and your expected result. You're going to use those essentially as an offline eval with the judge itself, but not with the rest of the system, just with the judge, to see if the judge gets each one of those correct. That's the ideal situation. And it's kind of crazy, but you can actually play a little game where you dump the scenario into JSON-L format, provide it as one of the elements to a prompt. And if you're having problems, provide the actual judge prompt itself and ask an LLM to rewrite it for you. I wouldn't take it directly, but you can see that there'll be nuanced changes, and you can use that as a additional mechanism to create a loop of information to figure out how better to phrase some of the judgments and some of the metrics. However you go about it, you will need to refine your judges. I am yet to see a one and done judge. That is to say, I'm yet to see a person able to sit down and write a judge perfectly the very first time and have it work for all conditions. So I do think that at some level, you're always going to end up, whether you start backwards or you start quote unquote forwards and just write your judge first, you will always need to look at final judgments, final metrics, take the outliers, and determine whether or not some of those were in fact correct passes or correct failures, down select, and rewrite your judge so you can get back through. All right. I kind of threw this in. It's something that we're learning is incredibly important. It's not strictly speaking about judges, but it's a place where we think judges are incredibly valuable. There's really no means to have a human watching every single interaction out in the real world. And at the same time, observability or pure observability is you're just getting spans. It doesn't really help you understand what's happening. It's grains of sand. It's great as a developer if you want to dig in and see a particular item and debug it, but it doesn't help much in terms of understanding whether or not your GenAI is working as you would expect it to. So having a select number of judges that you attach to the, and again, I would attach them asynchronously to your observability layer. Um, and then you can attach monitors to those and potentially even alerts, helps you understand when you have an issue and when you need to step forward and make changes. Now, this is something we do natively at Okareo, but it's also something you can construct if you're building your own system. And at the end of the day, it also gives you a way to see health cards, like how healthy is my, in this case, agent, how healthy is my agent right now? What types of problems is it having? You can even use the judges as a means to understand user traffic and user behavior in it. So you could have, in the case of that real estate agent, you could have a judge that's just categorizing people as buyers and sellers, and then you could have on your health card that metric of buyer versus seller and see how many people are buyers and how many people are sellers that are using that chatbot. It seems like a minor thing, but it actually would be hard to do through a user analytics tool or anywhere else. You actually do have to look at the conversation to determine what kind of person is coming through and what kind of conversation they're having and what topic they're focused on. So really, you can use judges in a very broad set of manners, and I think this is one of the ones that is really meaningfully helpful once you get to production and you're actually trying to see how your system is behaving. End of the day, just like anything else, simple. Simple is best. Just get started with a few judges. Make them asynchronous, keep them passive on the outside, refine, learn to do that refinement life cycle with the judges. And once you start to get that, then you can start to add more and more into the mix and start to see how your agent or how your Gen AI is working. We, of course, provide tools for all of this. I welcome everyone to come try out those tools. You can sign up. It's very easy to make judges and checks. It's easy to set up evaluations. It's easy to set up observability and get those alerts and monitors and whatnot. But again, it's something you can also build on your own and you can also step through. At the end of the day, you will always wind up building your own judges. So we have some for you to use, others do as well, but you will need to write your own judges that are specific to your conditions. Thank you.